Right. Thank you everyone so much for joining. We're going to give our attendees and guests just a minute or two to get logged into Zoom here, and we'll begin the webinar in just a minute. All right, well, I think we can go ahead and kick off, and we'll have folks joining as we get through our introduction here. But thank you very much to our panelists for joining us this afternoon, and for our guests and attendees for joining us for what is the first of several Whiteboard Advisors webinars that we're going to be hosting on what's next in education journalism. This particular webinar is going to kick us off with a group of national, local, and national trade higher education reporters who are covering everything that's going on in the world of higher education, what's affecting college students and colleges today. And certainly there's never a bad time to talk about trends in higher education journalism and what's the issues that are animating coverage of colleges and their students today. But in 2021, we're certainly in a very interesting and complex and dynamic time for colleges and their students. Everything from declining enrollment to a much broader national conversation around the topic of race and racism in our country, complex issues related to COVID-19 and the reopening of college campuses, controversies involving college admissions, and much, much more than we could realistically cover in today's conversation. So we're going to use our time to engage a group of what is by any measure a very qualified and insightful group of journalists who are covering this space, many of whom you may know and have met. I'll just quickly introduce each of them and thank them for joining us this afternoon, and then we'll begin some discussion. Going to my immediate right, we have Scott Jassick, who is the founder and editor of Inside Higher Ed. Joining us also is Jeff Salingo, former editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Times bestselling author and a contributor to The Atlantic and The Washington Post. Chris Quintana, who is an education enterprise reporter for USA Today. Bianca Quilanten, who is a higher education reporter for Politico. And finally, Jewel Jackson, who is joining us from El Paso, Texas, as the higher education correspondent for El Paso Matters, a member of the Open Campus Media nonprofit journalism network. So a new entrant reporting on local higher education issues from the state of Texas. So we're incredibly excited and grateful to have you all on today. One housekeeping note before we begin the discussion is that we will open this up to Q&A. So please submit your questions, comments that you might like to make using the Q&A feature or the chat. And in the last 5 or 10 minutes, we'll circle back to those and pose some specific questions to our panelists. So let's dive right into it. I don't think we need to do introductions, but I would like to do a quick around the horn, maybe starting with Scott and going around. But what's next for higher education journalism, and share your thoughts on this question. What's the biggest trend shaping higher ed journalism today, and why? Scott, kick us off.
So I'll punt a little bit and say that it's really two trends. There's a lot of successful higher ed journalism in Washington, D.C., New York, looking at not just us in the Chronicle, but looking at the publications represented on this panel. There are a lot of people getting hired to do good higher ed journalism. But at the same time, there are a lot of small cities and towns where it's struggling, where people are getting laid off, or where one person has to cover a whole bunch of colleges and schools. So I sort of see us in two worlds. On the one hand, it's great to see all the people getting hired and doing good work. But on the other, I'm really worried that something big could be going on at a lot of small town colleges, and we might not know about it.
Joelle, I'd love to bring you into this, given where Scott brought us on that first response.
I would say what I'm kind of looking forward to tracking more is probably mental health. I think a lot of students kind of returning back to in-person classes, on-campus interactions that was new for certain classes, but also just having to put themselves back into a functioning society somewhat is an interesting way of looking at motivation factors, overall energy, mental health, just care, period. So that's something I would like to just delve a little bit more into, and really looking at our worth ethics and overall just kind of motivation and what that stems for students and how they perform.
And let's go to Jeff. Jeff, what's the, from your perspective, what's the big issue driving or trend driving higher ed journalism today?
Well, I think the one that Scott said is probably the biggest, because as Scott knows, even going back to our days when Scott and I used to work together at the Chronicle, we really depended on local newspapers to try to see what was happening on the ground. We just did a Future You podcast episode that actually dropped today with 3 local reporters in Michigan, California, and Mississippi. And when you listen to that, you really get a sense of just in some ways how big this country is and how the higher education issues are so different depending on the locality and the state. And so I think the loss of local journalism, which I'm thrilled that my 2 former colleagues, Scott Smallwood and Sarah Hebel, are thinking about in terms of the Open Campus project. I think it's critically important as we think about the future of journalism. But like Scott, I'm going to take another trend as well. And I think the second one is kind of, we all represent in many ways, except maybe for me, represent publications in some ways, right? And I think we're starting to see the rise of more individuals covering colleges and universities more, people on Twitter, for example, and social media who don't necessarily work for publications. We're seeing more newsletters. I think that's a trend across journalism in general. It hasn't hit higher education as much, but we're starting to see more individual newsletters around different topics in journalism. Another former colleague of mine, Karen Fisher, writes a great one on international education. So we're starting to see, I think, the movement sometimes away from national publications and even local publications to individuals. I think there's some good and bad in that. I think that there's a lot of big publications that are able to have the deep benches and be able to dive into a topic for a long time that we're going to miss if we don't invest in those.
Well, given Jeff's caution about the rise of individual journalists, I'll go to some of the bigger newsrooms that are represented on here. And so, Chris, I'd love to get a pulse check from you on anything you've heard so far, or other trends that are shaping higher ed coverage and newsrooms today.
Yeah, thanks for asking, and I want to echo what has been said here. We rely on local journalists to kind of understand what's happening at the ground level, and that's where a lot of these issues kind of percolate up and make their make sense to us on kind of like a national scale. I think I'm also interested in the question of when we talk about like a diminishing local market, looking at who kind of fills that space. We're seeing an increase in nonprofit journalism, which we know that's there, and we've seen the successes in the form of like the 74 Million or Chalkbeat or kind of Hetchinger along those lines. I think we're seeing more of that. Open Campus is another great example, right? The collaboration with local journalists and kind of a nonprofit newsroom. And so I'm curious to see if the nationals continue to maintain their higher ed desks in the same way that they had in the past, and kind of what the value will be to some of these more established publications moving forward. And then also, if I could just take another quick bite at the apple and say, I think COVID, the pandemic is going to continue to shape our coverage as well. I'm still writing about we're starting to get to a phase where I think we're starting to see the coverage shift a little bit from the pandemic is happening and how are people responding to it, and we're moving in the direction where we're starting to see some universities scale back kind of what they had done to deal with COVID on campus, and so I think the fallout and kind of the long tail of this will continue to be a big part of higher ed journalism, not just for the precautions or changes in the form of like test optional or whatnot, but also like where did the emergency stimulus funding go? How did institutions use that? And so I think there's a lot of questions that couldn't be answered in the moment because we were too busy dealing with the immediate crisis. And so I expect those will be answered as more time goes along.
And so Bianca, maybe you can bring us, tie this together and bring in, some other perspectives on this, thinking about the politics and policy of higher education. What's the big thing that Politico is tracking these days?
I would just say, I've seen the shift in journalism already at Politico in the sense that my beat has personally changed in the last 3 years that I've been here. Now my focus is on civil rights and equity in higher ed and K through 12, but we've also hired an additional person to cover higher ed because we know that there's so much happening. But in the federal policy realm, I feel like equity is the biggest thing that the Biden administration is touting, and same in Congress. And so we're seeing different groups crop up, like we just saw an HSI board or executive board from the White House be introduced this past past week. And we're also seeing an emphasis on making higher ed accessible. I think that's always been in the back of everyone's mind as we're reporting, but it's actually closer to becoming, a reality, much closer than it's been in a very long time, I think. And so I think in general, like the focus on equity and how these students are faring through college, whether college is still, valued the same way as it was before the pandemic. I think those are all things that are coloring federal policy right now. And that's what we're mostly looking at.
And so I want to, it's interesting. We returned earlier to the impact on local newsrooms, shifting dynamics with journalism at the local level, and what that means for how outlets will cover local colleges and universities and their students in coverage that is hopefully valuable for their local audiences, students, parents, and others. And so, Jewel, I'd love to bring you back into this here and hear a little bit more about what you're seeing, either in terms of the impact of the pandemic or other key trends that you're following in El Paso through your coverage of higher ed for El Paso Matters.
Mm-hmm. I will preface and say that I am the first higher education reporter in over 30 years here in El Paso. So that kind of also goes with this conversation about local journalism and the importance of higher education. But in terms of what I'm covering and what matters to my local community here, I cover one public university, which is UTEP, or the University of Texas at El Paso, a community college, and then Texas Tech University has a health sciences center here. And throughout all the schools, the student population tends to be Hispanic and first generation students. That's pretty much what we see predominantly. And so stories about affordability are always big, kind of going back to Bianca's point, how to just make school accessible. We just see that, this pandemic has shown us that the higher education emergency relief funds signed into law, and that was a substantial help in getting students back to the classroom, but also making sure that they stayed in the classroom. And so I think getting that money, and then also students who qualified for financial help, also, it was just a good situation. And that was a very important story for me to tell. And then also with El Paso, we are a unique city. This is a border city. We live right next to the Mexican-American border. So stories about international students, their journeys of having to cross the Juarez border, and ultimately the entire political sphere surrounding immigration, border patrol does affect those daily lives of those students. So that's always a focus point. And then I would also say students are multifaceted. You know, they're not always in the classroom studying. They have various identities, whether that's the LGBTQ plus community, disabled community. We have an Indigenous Native American community here. So I also like to elevate those stories that aren't a part of the traditional higher education coverage realm. And then I guess to kind of just put it all together of how I even tackle all of this, I would say I go where students are at, which is social media. Twitter and Facebooks have been my best friends. I am able to join some discussion groups and just keep track of, you know, what is current on students' minds. So I can get sources directly from social media, but also get story ideas. So that's kind of what we're seeing here in El Paso.
And so one of the things you mentioned before was that obviously those CARES Act dollars, which have been distributed to, I guess, thousands of institutions, something like, you know, $60 billion in aid distributed across the country. And it ties into an issue that I think all of us are following in some way, which is, you know, what is happening with higher education enrollments across the country during COVID-19. And there's been a lot of interesting coverage around the impact of the pandemic on the enrollment of male students who seem to be disappearing in alarming or surprising numbers, particularly from community college campuses and others. Question for the group: I mean, how are you all covering this complex issue? What can we expect in the coming year, and what comes next in terms of coverage of enrollment in higher education?
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, the main thing is that it's, again, two stories. The elite universities, public and private, are doing quite well. The flagship publics are having records in enrollment, quality of enrollment, you know, all kinds of things. And the elite privates are doing exceptionally well. But at community colleges, at a lot of regional universities, are not doing so well. A little bit, it depends on geography. Texas universities are gaining because there's so many Texans. And similarly, California is doing well at the regional levels. But if you go to the Northeast of the United States, states like Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, the regional publics are in trouble. And so that's been the main thing. On the male story, I guess I would just say it's great that the Wall Street Journal discovered it, but this has been going on for 5-10 years, and I think all of us have written about it already.
Well, you know, it's better to come around to it sooner rather than later, I guess. But Chris, you know, I think that ties into something, you know, that you had mentioned wanting to bring up, which is, you know, this perception of sort of declining value or return on investment of the college experience, which I think accounts for, in part, this trend that Scott just mentioned in that last exchange of declining male enrollments. You know, how are you maybe thinking with that kind of broader national aperture or national audience that USA Today brings to this coverage? You know, why is that storyline around declining perception of value or return on investment so important to your readers right now?
Well, yeah. So if I can back up just a little bit there, I think it's interesting to see the return on investment question kind of rise in the way that it has, because I remember when I first came to DC, I kind of came with this assumption, that's when I started at the Chronicle of Higher Education back in 2017, moving from covering the University of New Mexico locally. I kind of came with this assumption that, you know, everyone equated going to college to getting a job, and was quickly told that, you know, the value of a college education is you know, extends far beyond earnings, and kind of was schooled in that rather quickly. And so it's interesting to me to see that conversation kind of emerging again as like a reliable value for a reliable marker of value for students, especially since that is so, you know, you talk to students from, you know, New Mexico, where I'm from, or from like a middle low income background, and you know, that is why people go to school. It's to improve their lives and to, secure a career that will allow them to earn enough to be satisfied with what they're doing, right? And so I think we are seeing that kind of come up in different sort of ways. I mean, a good example is, the Forbes rankings of colleges incorporating ROI into their equations, right? Like that seems to be a good indication that more people are thinking about this. We have the post-secondary value task. I'm sorry, I wrote about them and I'm having a hard time remembering the exact phrasing of words there. But they're looking also at the value that goes into a college education, and I think what is also spurring that is the availability of data from the education department tied to the college scorecard. Right, we have this data available and more readily accessible in ways that we haven't seen before, which is great. I think part of the challenge for reporters will be deciding when to use that data and when and what does it say. It is 2 years out from graduation, right? And I know that what I was making 2 years after I graduated is substantially different than what I am making now. And so I question, like that is certainly a good thing to have. And I'm curious to see stories about that conversation kind of around that space. But I wonder if it's telling us what we think it's telling us at this point, and then kind of what other measures might be looking at long term.
Any reaction from the group to that?
Yeah, Ted, I think, obviously value has been around for a while. This idea that, students go to college for a job. If you're just tracking the UCLA freshman survey data among traditional students, at least since 2008 or so, I think there's also, during the pandemic, when you had students largely learning online at many institutions, not necessarily getting the experience that they thought they were paying for. If they were paying for an in-person experience, I think people started to question what they were paying for, right? So especially residential students or students who are learning in person felt that they were paying for that in-person experience outside the classroom as well as inside it, and weren't necessarily getting it, right? So colleges and universities weren't delivering on that promise. And it's really hard to differentiate Econ 101 when everyone's learning online. I think what it really does is put front and center the quality of teaching, the quality of the professor, the quality of the course, more so than when probably a student is in class or on campus and thinking about all the other things that are happening. And so I think now there's this new dimension of value around the quality of the student experience overall. And in many ways, some people found that lacking during the pandemic, whether they were having trouble getting financial aid worked out, whether they were having trouble getting CARES Act money. Did they have to make 5 calls to the bursar's office, to the financial aid office, to their academic dean, right? There were so many instances, I think, during the pandemic where the friction of just day-to-day living and interacting with campuses was probably more, there was more friction than there needed to be. And I think that's, as we think about value coming out of the pandemic, that's one thing I'm following is how are students thinking about the quality of that campus experience?
I think one thing I also kind of want to just add in is students have responsibilities outside of their academics. So when it comes to enrollment, like Scott had mentioned, we saw a big drop when it comes to community colleges. And here, at least locally, this current fall semester, we've seen a 6% drop in enrollment. And then last year in fall 2020, it was a 10% drop in enrollment from the previous fall semester. And our student population at the community college is 50% parents. So that kind of speaks for itself, that 50% are parents. They tend to be older age students, and they are people that typically are trying to provide for a household. So I think on top of everything else that has been said, just recognizing that these people have to just tend to themselves, tend to their families, and that also had pulled them away from their educational studies. So I think a lot of what I'm seeing here at the schools is that they're trying to figure out what are those specific student populations that aren't returning, why, and then how we can get them back.
And so Bianca, I'd love to get your perspective, because I think one of the depending on the institution and the institution type, one of the things that is obviously so worrying about this is that the connection to between enrollment and finances. And so, our colleges and university friends have been fortunate to be backstopped by major rescue packages from the federal government, some of which are still making their way into college and university coffers, some of which have been used and others never spent. And so I'd love to get a sense from you, in terms of, these issues of college access and enrollment and the role that federal funding is playing in that. What's your sense of where we are now and what will come next?
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting time. I think most of my reporting lately has been how higher education, like lobbying groups, specifically either representing HBCUs or representing other college organizations, they've really been using their weight in this reconciliation package that we're discussing on whether or not someone will take it. It's fascinating to see how much weight they have over these congressmen and senators when it comes to making sure we have that funding for community colleges. But also something that's interesting is that there's a focus on this college completion fund that has been whittled down to like $9 billion from, I believe, more than 60 or about 60 that was promised by the Biden administration. And so there's a focus on making sure that if we invest in community colleges that don't have, or that is difficult to track what success looks like at a community college, will that be a good investment and will it actually help the students, graduate and get a better job if they're not going to community college? I am a community college grad. I know how hard it was to get out of a community college. I have friends still in community college when I was there. And so there's an intense focus on making sure that this policy has a return of investment at the end of the day. And then also, it's latched onto other parts of policy too. The community colleges are necessary because we need to find a pathway for pre-K teachers to get a degree at an affordable rate because they're not being paid enough to stay in their realm. So it's really an interesting place right now because it affects more than just higher ed itself. It affects the workforce. It affects childcare providers. It's everywhere. And then I think we're also seeing a focus on the whole student within Congress. We're rehearing, pushes to talk about textbook costs, even though that's a little bit more muffled at the moment. We're hearing about, how to support students with their transportation. Like Joelle was saying, how do I help you get childcare if you're a parent? That sort of thing. So there's a renewed focus on that in higher ed policy. And I think that is where the focus for admissions and enrollment is right now, is if we make this program free, will people go, or should we have made, double the Pell Grant instead? It's an interesting kind of fight that we're seeing these past few months.
Right. Yeah, I know that one of the hearings I saw recently was all about campus hunger, with testimony, once again bringing up the point that we may not have recognized exactly how widespread that problem might be. So I think it's a very point that's very well taken. Changing gears slightly, I'd love to turn to another topic, which obviously has been in the news, sometimes for controversial reasons, with perhaps a different type of institution, maybe on the more selective end of the spectrum. Or I forget, we may be banning that term from higher education coverage, high rejection rate. And so, Jeff, I'd love to really bring you in on this, because, I think that the topic of college admissions is obviously, if you're looking at this from, the volume of coverage that's out there on higher education, so much of it is focused on really understanding it. It's such an important issue to parents and to families. And I think the controversies of the last year or two have really brought to the fore how emotive and how complex this can be for so many Americans and those who are following and trying to understand higher ed. So you wrote a book on it. You've been speaking and interviewing widely on it. Would love to get your take on what's happening with the issue of college admissions right now, and what the focus of the book was.
So obviously the focus of the book was the year I spent inside college admissions pre-COVID, the year before COVID, the year that Varsity Blues broke, where I spent inside the college admissions process at 3 selective colleges and universities, of which there are very few in the country. And it's interesting how I think the media shapes this narrative, and probably we're all at fault at some point in our lives. But normally when I talk to any sort of group, whether it's parents or students or community-based organizations, I always ask them, do they think it's harder to get into college today than it was 20 or 30 years ago? And I'm, every group, no matter where I'm speaking, will raise their hands and say yes. Even though we know that's not the case necessarily, right? We haven't solved the completion and retention and access problems in this country. But one of the things we do know, as Scott was saying, there are these haves and have-nots amongst institutions, and there are a lot of institutions that would love students. And we know that the average acceptance rate is much higher, is 65% or something like that. So most colleges are accepting most students, but I think this is where the media does probably get a few dings, in that are too much of the focus, particularly among the national press, is on a select few institutions, and because of that, there's this narrative that's been shaped for too much of the public that it's hard to get into college, and that's not the case. And the question is, how do we break that? I just got back from NACAC, the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, had their annual meeting last week in Seattle, and we did a session on this with admissions directors and high school counselors around this idea. And I think to be honest with you, it starts with a lot of us on this panel. But I will tell you, pitching stories, because now I'm in the pitching business because I don't work for somebody full time. Pitching stories that doesn't include Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford is often difficult.
Other thoughts on this? I mean, Scott, you've covered this issue a lot. Are higher ed journalists getting admissions wrong? Are we oversimplifying this issue, or are there narratives that we haven't explored?
Oh, Jeff is absolutely right. The media should be criticized. I'll leave out the panelists we have here today, but generally, the media is obsessed with Ivy rates. Ivies in the Northeast, elite publics in the rest of the country. And again, just because the University of Illinois is doing great or the University of Michigan is doing great doesn't mean that the regionals are doing well in those states. It's just a fact that many of them are not. Pennsylvania, I mean, just go through the states where the flagship is doing great and everyone else isn't. It should be more of a story, because the people who are not going to the regionals or to the community colleges, they're not going, period. Some of them may be going to the for-profits, but in general, many people are being left out who could benefit. And that's a big story that I don't see a lot of attention to.
Other perspectives on the issue of college admissions. I'm curious to bring other panelists into this.
I think something interesting is that we're going to be looking at what are the qualifications to get in still. We saw this wave with the ACT and SAT, right? And so I think we're wondering, how long will that continue? Will it continue? I think that's something that we're always thinking about. But I think another thing with admissions is transfer rates. How do we make sure that these kids are transferring from community colleges to higher ed, and then units that are left over, how to make sure all of those credits are transferable. So I think transfer admission doesn't have that high of a focus typically. We're typically looking at first-time freshmen for overall admission numbers, but I think transfer numbers will become more important if, free community college becomes something, passed in the next month or so.
Yeah, it actually ties back to a point that you were raising earlier around the, sort of questions of equity in college access. And so, I know that's another, if you look at the overall community college enrollment, obviously has been received a tremendous amount of coverage, but also transfer rates have been declining quite alarmingly as well, and particularly for students of color and for in other underrepresented backgrounds. Any thoughts on the coverage of the transfer issue and issues that intrigue you guys?
Something that I think kind of correlates what we're seeing with the transfer issue is recruitment efforts. Here in El Paso, there is kind of this closed circle of where, you know, the students go through K through 12 and they usually typically go to UTEP, or they may go to the community college, or like Bianca mentioned, they may go to community college, transfer then to UTEP. But now with the pandemic and all the realities that we've kind of discussed, we're having to look at elsewhere recruitment of not just recruiting who's in El Paso, but hey, we got to go to New Mexico, we got to go to Arizona. And so I think that's also an interesting conversation as to like how we're getting these students and like who are we trying to appeal to. So that's what I'm also kind of seeing with this admissions and just transferring credit happening.
So I want to turn to another topic here, and this is something that you know, some of our attendees have asked about, and I think all of us are focusing on in different ways. But you know, that everything that's happening in higher education today, everything we've discussed, obviously is occurring against this much broader kind of backdrop of a conversation on race and racism, social inequality, dating back to the protests and activism that we saw over the past year. And in many ways, higher ed was sort of ahead of the curve in terms of some of the more complex and sensitive conversations around race, not exactly a stranger to you know, this being a major issue on our college campuses. And so, you know, I wonder, this is obviously throughout the Trump administration, you know, campus activism on a range of topics was a major issue. But I'm curious, you know, from every vantage point, whether it's student affairs, college admissions, the higher education experience in general, what issues are you all covering as it relates to the broader conversation on race in America?
I'll jump in there, Ted. I think one of the issues that I'm interested in and have written a little bit about and want to write more about is this idea that, you know, students are looking for a sense of belonging and purpose in higher education. I think this goes back to the ROI and value argument from before. And I think one of the interesting things is that as our college campuses have become much more diverse, and particularly just in the last 10 plus years, because of the way particularly faculty on campuses do not turn over very much, is that, and Pew has done a lot of work on this, and you know, there's obviously the national data from the education department, is that we're starting to see a very big divide between essentially the you know, the background, the race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class of faculty and of the students they teach. And I think this came up a lot during the pandemic. I heard from a lot of faculty members who seem to have, for the first time in their teaching careers, understood the lived experiences of their students because they saw it every day on Zoom or didn't see it on Zoom as opposed to the classroom. And so I think that this, as institutions, and I also have a different role in terms of, I sit on a board of a private college in upstate New York as well. This is an issue that we talk about often as we try to diversify the faculty and can't really keep up with how quickly the student body is diversifying. And it's creating real issues around this idea of belonging and purpose for students who are first generation, students of color, students from low income backgrounds who really do not see themselves reflected in the curriculum or in the teaching staff of the institutions.
If I could say something, I totally agree with what Jeff said, but another big issue that we have to talk about is that there are racist incidents on just about every campus. Today, we have a story about the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where a nasty email with racist things in it was sent to most of the minority student groups on campus. This kind of thing is very common, and it may be from students, it may not be from students, no one knows. But this kind of thing happens all the time. You know, on every campus, on campuses with a lot of minority students, on campuses with few minority students. And it's just way too present in the lives of students today.
If I could just hop in there and say, there's certainly value in talking about kind of the lived experience on campus, but I've been trying to write more about kind of the sort of societal barriers that we put in the way to low income and students of color, and just cribbing from something that I wrote about recently, thinking about like FAFSA verification, right? And the waiver that had been in place there, and kind of what, the pandemic kind of allowed the government to roll that back a little bit. And we're able to see, if you look at the messaging from the Department of Education themselves, there is an acknowledgement that this affects, students of color more than it affects, everyone else. And so I think any part of sort of higher ed, conversations around race or equity has to also include like the path to get there, and sort of the barriers that we put in place. And I mentioned the test optional movement earlier, and I recognize that not all selective colleges, or that a number of colleges, that may not be the deciding factor for a lot of folks. But I think it's the perception for people, and the idea of where they can go and how open these institutions actually are for them, that resonates and matters to the students on the ground. So I think that's what I'd make a pitch for more of that coverage generally.
And to maybe like flip the question a little bit, and bring it to a more happier note, UTEP is also a Hispanic serving institution. So for me, being able to cover the in-person graduation ceremonies this past summer, and I think that was the first, in-person that we've had since the pandemic started, that was very refreshing to see all these minorities graduating and recognizing that they were doing something for themselves as individuals, but like I said, we have a lot of first generation, so that means they're doing something for their family. And then there's the city of El Paso celebrates that, because we're creating and developing new talent that's going to just want to see it through in the future. So I think telling also those successful stories, and showing that students can be successful, they've accomplished this. I spent a week with a first generation student, and I just tracked kind of her last week in classes and how she was feeling, her anxiety about getting a job. But ultimately it came out that she did it. She did, she's the first in her family to graduate. And now no matter what, her future looks very bright. So I think when it also comes to these conversations of race and stuff like that, kind of flipping the narrative and not always pushing something bad, but also saying that we can develop something good out of it and showing those stories too.
It ties to another question that, I hadn't thought about asking, but I think is useful to bring up. To Bianca's point earlier about HSIs and HBCUs, I do think there's been a lot of really thoughtful coverage of minority serving institutions and people kind of, having maybe a renewed appreciation for the role that they do. Bianca, I don't know if you care to expand on, what you're seeing in the HBCU sector or some of the advocacy that's happened, but I do think it's a really important area for discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we've seen, a heightened focus on them. We have the first vice president, right, who is an HBCU grad. And so we've seen this heightened focus on those institutions because of that. We've also seen it because we've heard stories about disparate impact for students of color, especially Black students, right? So we were talking earlier about all the big donations, right, to these institutions. I do think that this focus on HSIs will be really interesting. I don't think that we've had such a narrow focus on HSIs in the recent past, especially with this new caucus on HBC or HSIs being founded, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago. Everything is like 2 weeks ago for me right now. Yeah, so I think that will be interesting, like who will be the key players, because HSIs are a different breed. One day you can be an HSI and the next day or the next year you might not be due to your enrollment, right? Right. And we saw Latino enrollment take a hit in some institutions. So, and the same goes with, there's always this interesting, not fight, but it's a little bit of one between the HSIs that maybe are more well-funded, because you could be a really big public institutions and receive a lot of money compared to a community college that's an HSI and doesn't receive that much money. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch to see how they balance those two competing priorities and which institutions will be lifted, which ones won't be, and then who will be the key players in those caucuses and within that White House board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to start to, just as a quick reminder, if the folks who have joined us have questions that they'd like to pose to our journalist guests, please use the Q&A feature of the chat, as I see somebody is doing right now, which is so helpful to illustrate the point. Please send us your questions, and we'll start to mix those in and bring in some more audience engagement. One of the questions that was just posed, and I think has run throughout some of these conversations around enrollment and students who have been impacted by the pandemic in different ways, is the question of adult learners. And so, speaking of people who are late to the party and have been missing out on trends that have been long running throughout higher education, Scott, adult learners are not a new trend, not something that happened just during the pandemic, but obviously it's a demographic that's received a lot of interest and renewed attention, I think, because of the types of students who have been most directly impacted by the financial hardship of the pandemic, as well as displaced workers and others who are returning to start something new or find something new or to finish a degree. So how are the journalists in this group thinking about coverage of the adult learner issue? Is this a demographic that's, you think, is better understood than it was historically? Are we moving away from kind of that pop culture narrative around the traditional college student, or do we still have more work to do in terms of explaining who today's students look like?
Well, I mean, it would be nice if we perhaps didn't have two cultures, but we do. And to talk about adult learners without talking about traditional age, it just doesn't make sense, because their issues are so different. I just go back to what I said at the beginning. Community colleges primarily serve adult learners, and community colleges did a lot to serve adult learners. They gave away a lot of laptops, because a lot of community college students don't have a laptop, and which is amazing to think about. But they are trying to study and learn without laptops. Community colleges, a lot of community colleges put their wireless online in their parking lots. So when the community college was closed, the students could come there and congregate. But a parking lot isn't a great place to study. And I think that just shows what we're dealing with when you talk about community colleges, or when you talk about adult learners. Look at where they are studying. And they're studying at places that have lost enrollment and are not doing well, by and large. There are exceptions to the rule. Southern New Hampshire University has done great during the pandemic, because they have a good program for online education, and because it's an existing program, they knew how to do online education. They weren't just learning last spring. And so, I don't know. I think we still have a lot of work to do on adult learners.
Other thoughts on adult students or college and universities' efforts to serve that population better during the pandemic or beyond?
Ted, I mean, when I speak to, I speak to a decent amount of boards, and adult learners always come up, especially at institutions that don't really serve them right now, right? That serve mostly a traditional, and I hate to use that word because traditional is really non-traditional now, audience. And it always amazes me when you think about the market of adult students and how much larger it is than the traditional market of high school graduates, which is small and shrinking. While the number of students who have some college credit and no degree, and the number of people who graduate from high school and never went to college is just so much larger. And then, by the way, you add on top of that people who have college degrees who now need, upskilling and reskilling. It's a huge market, and I just don't think they understand how to serve them. And that to me is, if I was writing for a trade magazine trying to reach other college leaders, that, the example Scott's giving, that's what they always want to know. Well, how does Southern New Hampshire, I mean, he's right, Southern New Hampshire, Arizona State, Western Governors, all those institutions that were largely serving adult students, mostly through online education, came out of this pandemic really well. And in fact, had overwhelming demand. So if I'm looking at that as a president or a trustee of a college that's losing enrollment right now and losing revenue, I'll say, well, wait a second. Why are we continuing to go after these 18-year-olds when there's all these other students out there? But then the question is how? How do we do it? Because it is a very different way sometimes of serving these students who just have different needs than an 18-year-old right out of high school. And those are the stories I think that more colleges need to know. I think there's some colleges that are willing to serve adult students. I just don't think they know how to do it.
Really quick. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. I'll be quick with this one. Just when we're talking about adult learners, something I think about in that space is certainly a lot of folks are going to community colleges, but there's also a lot of folks going to, proprietary institutions. And some of the things that Scott was talking about, free laptops. I mean, that we saw that from the for-profit sector as well, right? And so I'm curious when that conversation starts, and I'm not curious about where adult learners think which college they think is going to serve their needs and who is reaching them, via advertising or from word of mouth from their friends. Every time I talk with students who've been in the sector for a while, say, oh, well, my friends went to this school and they had a good experience, or vice versa. So regarding that question, I think that's something where I'd like to focus my coverage on as well.
And then to be really quick too, one thing that we're kind of working on and actually going to be publishing a story on this week, so be on the lookout, but it's childcare when it comes to adult learners. I think when I was working on this story about childcare here locally and how that ties in with higher education, it is surprising as to how many campuses do not offer resources or really that much financial help, and childcare is expensive. So I think when it comes to adult learners, addressing that issue and addressing how universities could adapt to that would be something. And then even too, I've heard that professors and their viewpoint of, like we kind of been saying, what is a traditional student, and being surprised that adult learner may come into their classroom and may have a kid and may have accommodations that they need, has been also a conversation between students and professors that's being echoing more into the media as to how we can change this mindset of who a student is and what they look like. I think that's just something that we also need to keep in mind when it comes to adult learners.
Absolutely. And so I want to, in the last couple of minutes that we have, get to some more audience Q&A here. And so one of our attendees is interested in learning more about how practitioners in the nonprofit space and others can support higher education journalists in their reporting, beyond the standard outreach. Are there practices in this era that are helpful, or topics that you'd like to hear more about? And so I think it's a great question about how third-party organizations, colleges and universities themselves, nonprofits and others can be better partners in supporting higher education journalism and being more thoughtful in their communications. Any immediate reactions from the group? I know you all deal with lots of folks externally every day. So are there things that our guests could do to be more supportive of your coverage? Take that in any direction that you will.
I'll go first. So sometimes my inbox is a disaster. Like it is a scary place to be. So if I don't get back to you, it's not because it's not a good story idea. I missed it. So if it's something that is in my realm, which is civil rights and equity in K through 12 and higher ed, DM me on Twitter or text me or just something to re-up it, because it's not because I just didn't care for it. I just didn't see it. So I know people sometimes don't like to be bugged everywhere, but I kind of do because my email is a disaster.
One way to maybe rephrase it that I think is interesting is, are there perspectives that you all feel are overrepresented or underrepresented in higher ed today? And so, we mentioned earlier in the conversation, sort of increased discussion around the role of HBCUs and HSIs, and how Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and UPenn get a disproportionate share of their coverage. No offense to those institutions who we also like, but are there voices that you all would like to hear more from who you're not, or stories who reflect individuals whose experiences have not really been reported on in a very direct way yet?
Something we've struggled with of late is geography. And I don't mean the geography of not having everyone near Washington, but if you are in Texas or Florida or Mississippi or Alabama right now, you are under hugely different COVID restrictions or non-restrictions, as the case may be. And we've written a lot of stories about that because it's truly amazing that, in Mississippi last week, they banned colleges from requiring vaccines. This is really weird. But we've had a tough time getting intelligent, thoughtful people to talk who will represent the governor's point of view. And it's been more so than in other times. States have always had Republican governors or been, not with whatever the national trend is in higher ed. But I think it's worse. And if any of these groups can help, that'd be great.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I was just going to say, what I found particularly helpful from folks I've worked with in the nonprofit sector, these concepts, a lot of the stuff we deal with, policy concepts, right? These are abstract and sort of harder to pin down sometimes. I find that the folks that have helped me find people to talk to who are living these realities go a long way. And there is some skepticism, I think, from a journalistic perspective. Sometimes you wonder, are the people being brought to me being, are they the perfect case study, or is this really representative of kind of what
Right.
the reality is of the situation? But I think having that person kind of from the get-go indicates to the reporter that okay, there actually are people who are involved, and maybe it's not this person, but I know that I can find more, or maybe I can use this person. I think just that perhaps that's basic, but for folks on deadline or folks kind of getting up to speed on a new subject, that can be really helpful sometimes. And I would also echo Bianca's point about just the disastrous state of my inbox, and I do find that and I think people can speak to this experience. I am more responsive on DMs on Twitter. But I guess I'll just add the caveat that if that happens too much, it may just be in my inbox all over again. So.
Right. Everyone go blow up Chris's DMs after this. I know we only have a minute or two left, and I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and thank them again for joining us for this great discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think it's such a fascinating time to be following higher ed, but when isn't, I guess. I'll just send us off with one kind of final around the horn question. And since we have fellow professional journalists on here, and we don't want Jeff stealing Scott's idea or Chris stealing Bianca's idea or any creative borrowing of trends, this can be broad and just a general idea. But what is the next big thing or the next big idea that you're planning to cover? And Joelle, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Okay. For me, when I first got here, the issue of brain drain was a really prominent thing, which is El Paso is able to produce graduates, but they're not able to retain them. So the local economy is not catching up with, the industries and sectors needed to employ these students. And then as well, they're not offering competitive wages. So we're losing a lot of students who are going to Dallas, Houston, elsewhere. So right now, tying in like the economy and the education has really been something that I want to delve more into. We did a story initially about how alums have had to readapt and go elsewhere to use their degree, but a lot of people want to stay home and they want to stay in El Paso. So looking at how that economy is progressing or not progressing, and then what we're doing to attract and keep these graduates. And that relationship is something I want to look into.
Got it. Bianca, the next big thing for you.
I'm writing on HSIs right now. A lot of you didn't, pick that up. But also Title IX is something, and the overhaul of those regs. And then of course, sometimes I don't know what my big story is, so call me. That's what I say. So
Chris, the next big thing for USA Today higher ed coverage.
Well, there's a couple of things. We've kind of got a built-in deadline with student loans next year, January 2022. I know that's far away, but people are still very interested in their student loans, and I expect that to be a continuing conversation. And kind of a corollary there is just free college, right? And what does that actually look like? That doesn't have to exist in a vacuum necessarily. There are a lot of college promise programs that have created some, spaces that are similar to what is trying to be accomplished on kind of a national level. And so I think questions around what those actually look like in practice, and do students who attend no loan schools actually leave with no loans, right? Like that's the sort of thing that I think we'll be looking at long term.
Jeff, the next big thing for jeffsalingo.com.
I'm really thinking about, is this a moment that, we tend to overestimate, I think sometimes the moment we live in, and is COVID really going to change colleges and universities, particularly around teaching and learning? What pieces of online education will stick? What won't? What will go back to the normal of 2019? I'm kind of interested in seeing what really does happen in the next couple of years.
Scott, you have nothing to cover, probably just taking it easy, not reading the news until 4 a.m. and waking up at 5 to start thinking about higher ed. What's on your docket?
It is all COVID. COVID is shaping everything. And so right now, I'm not sure what we'll be writing in 6 months, but it will be COVID related, is my prediction.
Got it. Well, I know we're a minute or two past time. Thank you all very much for making the time and sharing your insights. Scott, Jeff, Chris, Bianca, Joelle, thank you again. Thank you to our attendees. And we look forward to having folks on for the next installment of our Whiteboard Advisors Education Journalism webinars. So have a great afternoon.